Introducing the ME3400 series switch. This nugget really puts a stake in the ground into an entirely new section within the series called Metro Ethernet. So Metro Ethernet being the technology that really has changed the way a lot of businesses do business, because regardless of the technology the service provider uses to get it there, they essentially terminate the customer premise connection on an Ethernet jack, and then use Q&Q tunneling. They'll use MPLS, all kinds of different stuff within the core to essentially bridge these sites all together on what feels like to the customer a big switch or a layer 2 network sitting in the cloud, to where they can literally connect their switches straight up to the WAN link, if we can even call it that anymore, and trunk their networks through, allowing VLANs to span wide area networks. I mean, it's really a neat technology, and it changes the paradigm that customers use. But that's not the focus. I'm like, after all that, that's not the focus of this nugget. The focus is on this special series of switch called the ME3400. Now, hang on. ME3400, that model can change, right? So if you're watching this years from now and it's the ME3450 or 3500 or something, I mean, essentially the concept is the same. It's a switch specially designed by Cisco to help us, the service providers, deliver this kind of service to the customer securely. So we're going to look at where does the Me switch fit. It's kind of like the I switch, right? Yeah, it's an I switch. It's a Me switch. Where does this fit in the network? What is very special about this switch? What is the feature set Cisco has geared this thing with? And then what are the different kinds of ports that we'll encounter on the ME? Here are your do I know this already questions, so feel free to pause, read through those. If you know them already, move right along. Otherwise, here we go. Well, let me start off by bringing up the Cisco NGN model, which, again, is the big picture of a service provider, from their core network down to their aggregation point to consolidate all of those point of presence, the POPs, where they've put in the fiber, the expense to reach the individual customers. And we have to identify, okay, where does this ME series switch fit? The answer is right there. ME series. It's in the crack between the service provider and the customer. It is designed for multi-tenant facilities. So one of the jobs I had here was actually here in Arizona, was at a location called Park Central Mall. It was actually the very first mall built in Arizona. It was an outdoor mall. You would drive your car up, park here, and you would come up. This is a big sidewalk kind of wrapping around, and they had a flower shop there. Starbucks was there. A tax attorney, it's not a tax attorney, but a tax consultant and an attorney's office sitting here. They had a training facility. Well, give you two guesses where I worked. At the flower shop, right? Training facility there. Anyway, food vendors. They had all these different, essentially, vendors there. So think of this from the service provider perspective. They got their shovels out, dig, running fiber optic cable. They come to this facility where they meet with the landlord because they're trying to win all this business. And the landlord's go, oh, well, I've already run the cabling. You know, there's Cat 5 run to each one of these. This is where the service provider would bring in their fiber, terminate it right there into an ME series switch, which could then connect to that Cat 5, Cat 6, whatever, cabling that reaches each one of those tenants. Now, right there, that should already give you a clue into some of the special powers that this switch has, because what's to keep the flower shop out of the tax consultant's records, you know, if they're all connecting to a switch, right? A layer 2 kind of device. So that's really what this thing is designed to do, is connect, and yet in a very secure way, separate each of the customers that are connected to it. So these are the typical spaces: multi-tenant office space, you know, where executive suites are separating, but you've got, you know, one switch to connect them all. Strip malls, condominiums, and let your mind go to wherever those kind of facilities are. That's where the ME series fits. So hello, Metro Ethernet switches. And I started this off just by saying, such as the Cisco ME3400, just because Metro Ethernet switches, they've already gone through multiple editions of switches before they reached the 3400. It's just, as I'm recording this, the 3400 is the latest and greatest one out. So just keep in mind, this same feature set, anything with ME in front of it, is there. They sell these things with different iOS versions, I would say two of which you really want to know the difference: Metro Base and Metro IP Access. So the Metro Base, and think of this as a base feature set on a switch. Number one is rate limiting. Why? Well, because remember, you're bringing your fiber optic cable into the facility as the carrier and then reaching these individual customers. Well, the price that they pay you is going to be what you set their speed on the switch. So, and that's you always hear people say you pay hundreds of dollars more a month, and the service provider types a single command. It's true. on the Metro Ethernet switches, they come in there and maybe throttle you down to 50 megabits per second until you pay them more, and then somebody comes into this configuration and says, okay, you're now 100 megabits per second just by typing a single command dealing with rate limiting. Quality of service, because a lot of times these guys will be delivering voice video data over a single connection, so we need to differentiate between the two. Q&Q tunneling, allowing customers to do the Metro Ethernet where they can connect into, here's customer A connecting into that switch. Well, you can actually tunnel their VLANs that are coming through essentially the outside VLAN of the carrier. Enhanced security, meaning we want to block off the ability to see things like Cisco Discovery Protocol packets or LLDP or spanning tree, where a customer could goof us up. I mean, typically switches, you wouldn't think much about spanning tree, limiting that and all that kind of stuff. Well, actually you would. but at the same time, you don't want customers' spanning tree integrating with your spanning tree and throwing you for a loop. I bet you whoever even came up with that saying didn't even think about spanning tree, and that is so applicable. I'm gonna have to use that. I just did. So they could that was not planned, even though it sounded like it was. So they could throw you for a loop by integrating into your spanning tree, so you can limit and disable and actually block by default spanning. So that's some of the enhanced security. And let me even mention more. Enhanced security on these switches is that by default, customers plugging into them can't reach each other, which works so well for the multi-tenant access. So, as we run these individual cables to all the individual customers and buildings, each one of these is treated as its own little world. Right? More on that in a second. So the Metro IP Access version allows you to do layer 3 switching. Essentially, just think of when you upgrade to this iOS version, which is a cost increase, you get layer 3 functionality on it, where you can create IP routing instances on there. You can do why is the name slipping my mind? What's the virtual interface? SVIs, switch virtual interfaces on there, VLAN interfaces on there, virtual routing forwarding. So essentially, virtualization of your device into individual kind of quasi routers communicating, policy-based routing protocols, OSPF, even BGP. I mean, there's a lot these things can do once you crank up the iOS version. The last thing I want to give you on this switch overview are the different kinds of ports that you can have on this switch. This is unlike a typical Cisco switch, iOS based or anything else. By default, the ME3400 has mostly UNI ports. That's user network interfaces, which are the ports connecting to the individual users. I grabbed a switch straight off the site. This is the ports that go into the individual tenants of a building or something like that. And by default, these ports have all of the, I'll say, typical functionality you would see in a switch, like Cisco Discovery Protocol. Matter of fact, it's all right here instead of rewriting it. All of that disabled, and let me just jump down here. They are sectioned off from each other using a kind of, I put a la private VLAN, meaning I'm sure behind the scenes Cisco used private VLANs to do this, but you don't see it in the running config because each one of these customers are essentially broken off from each other. So by default, and by the way, unlike a typical switch, all the ports are shut down by default. A normal Cisco switch, they're all up and it works just like a normal switch when you pull it out of the box, and then you just have to optimize it from there. Well, in this, all of these are shut down by default. Do you get the feel as you just read through these that this is built for a service provider choking, built for a service provider who doesn't want a customer coming in and getting access unless the service provider intentionally goes out to that device and says, no shut, let's power that one on, let's give it an IP address. So UNI is the typical ports. NNI, and by the way, by default, UNI and ENI are restricted to only communicate with the NNI ports, is the network interface. So this is going to be the ones that are uplink. So on this switch, and by default, this is the way it is pulling out of the box, it's the ones separated. Typically the SFP ports, because they all have SFPs to where you can slide in whatever kind of module you want, a fiber module, fiber module, single mode, multi-mode, whatever kind of fiber you're running into that device, that is considered the network port, and it does run the services by default, and by default, the UNI ports can communicate with that. Now, something else I want to mention before I forget, I didn't put it here as a bullet, but you can get these guys to communicate to each other by using private VLANs. As a matter of fact, it's known as a community. If you configure a private VLAN community on this device, you can, so for instance, maybe there's a multi-tenant configuration, but these three, essentially one tenant ended up buying those three office suites and kind of combining them in together as one, and they want them to be able to talk. Well, you can do that by using community VLAN to do that. These, and let me also, I'm still stuck on this UNI. Let me jump down here. By default, just about every port is UNI, but you can configure them as ENI, which is exactly the same thing as a UNI. But ENI allows you to run all of these services. Matter of fact, it turns them all back on by default, which is kind of creepy, and that's why they don't have that turned on by default. Same thing with network node interfaces. You can, and don't hear me wrong, you can flip over some of these as NNIs. I can say, well, actually, I want those to be communicating in the same way. They're uplinks to our other devices as a carrier. You can flip them over to whatever kind of personality you want those ports to have. This is just out of the box default. UNI and ENI also perform control plane policing. So, for instance, somebody tries to unleash an attack against the carrier switch. Well, just out of the box, UNI and ENI ports will block that. They'll throttle them back down. No, you can't telnet to me. Those kind of things. You can also flip the ports to routed ports. Hang on, let me get this. Using the no switch port command. So, for instance, if I don't want this to be a layer 2 port, and I have, what's the key? IP access, the Metro IP access image on there, I can type in no switch port and it goes shunk and becomes a layer 3 interface. So again, think of this from a carrier design perspective. You could set this up as a routed layer 3 port going back to your core, and then break these off into individual, maybe /30 subnets. So you send a maybe a /24 block of public IPs. That's a pretty big one, but down to the switch, and then you carve that up within the switch into a whole bunch of /30 subnets that you use to do point-to-point links to individual customers. Pretty cool device, huh? If you don't know what I just told you about it, it will drive you nuts the first time you work with one. It happened to me. I saw one of these. It was actually just sitting on a table. And I was like, oh, I could use that. And so I connected up some devices with it, and I couldn't get anything to communicate. I was like, what's wrong? I was like, is this a bad switch? What's wrong with this? Until I started doing a little research just based on the model number. I'm like, oh, okay, I see how this thing works. So that is the ME series switch. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.